So Democrats have been employing a very interesting strategy in deep red states over the past couple of years. They've essentially been throwing all their support behind an independent candidate as opposed to running their own candidates in the hopes that this independent candidate can win over enough people in the middle of the political spectrum, as well as even a segment of conservatives in order to be able to win statewide in important elections. And we saw this in Kansas back in 2014 with the Senate race, 2022 in Utah with the Senate race, and again, we're going to talk about, which is the focal point of this video, in Nebraska with Nebraska's Senate election, which, interestingly enough, all these races tend to be Senate elections, but this isn't necessarily the only instance in which Democrats have done this. So we're going to talk about what this strategy entails, why Democrats are doing this, and ultimately analyze how effective such a strategy could be in deep red states like Nebraska, Utah, etc. So we're going to get to all of that in just a second, but first, if you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing down below and liking this video if you enjoy. So the independent in question when it comes to Nebraska is a man by the name of Dan Osborne. His background instantly screams to me that he does have some very progressive positions. He's an industrial mechanic and union leader who was previously employed at the Kellogg's plant in Omaha before being fired due to a Kellogg strike in 2021. And he's running as an independent. And if we take a look at his platform on his website, he does have a mix of very populist positions, as well as throwing some bones to conservatives. For instance, talk about securing the border, which even some Democrats are talking about as the border has become such a massive issue and has really affected every state in the country, not just those on the border. But, you know, cutting taxes for businesses in the middle class, that's more of a Republican talking point. Right to repair, sort of a Democratic talking point. But then you go into here, legalizing cannabis, that's a very progressive opinion. Passing congressional term limits, that's just more of a populist position overall. So Dan Osborne strikes me as sort of a populist, old-fashioned Democrat who tends to overperform in red states, but ultimately still ends up losing. Kind of reminds me a bit of Richard Ojeda back in West Virginia before he became, you know, just a fanatical progressive Democrat. But before that, he was sort of running as you know, a progressive populist economically, as more of a social conservative who liked guns and things like that. And of course, conveniently, once he lost that election, all those positions on guns and all the other social issues immediately reversed back to the left. So, you know, some of this is a bit of a gimmick, but of course you got to do this in order to win Republican states. But, you know, this isn't the first time we've seen this. In fact, back in the 2022 midterms, we had this with a candidate by the name of Evan McMullin, who was a former Republican policy advisor who actually ran for president in 2016 and got over 20% of the vote in Utah, which, you know, basically dragged down Donald Trump's vote percentage down to like 45%. And I think Hillary Clinton was barely above 20% in the state. But in 2022, he challenged Mike Lee, who basically morphed into more of a MAGA Trump-supporting Republican. And, you know, he did very good for a non-Republican in the state of Utah, getting nearly 43% of the vote, only losing to Mike Lee by a little bit over 10 percentage points. And if we take a look at his margins overall in traditionally Democratic counties, you'll notice that they're a lot larger than candidates like Joe Biden or other Democrats typically get. Specifically, when we get to Salt Lake City, Evan McMullin is winning Salt Lake County by almost 20 percentage points. Just for reference, if we go back to the 2020 election, Joe Biden only wins Salt Lake County by about 11. So this independent definitely overperformed. And Evan McMullin's whole pitch was that he was a Republican, a moderate conservative, who was the only person who had a realistic shot at beating Mike Lee in a conservative state. And I think that's the calculation that many Democrats are starting to make. Now, Utah is a bit of a unique state. It has a very large young population. You also have a very transient population in the Salt Lake area. Most of the people in Salt Lake aren't actually Mormons. You have a lot of non-Mormons moving into the Salt Lake region who tend to be more liberal, probably from California, Washington, other places on the West Coast that tend to vote for Democrats. You also have this effect in Utah where a lot of non-Republicans are registering as Republicans in order to vote in Republican primaries, which is oftentimes why you see Republican nominees in Utah for Congress, Senate in the case of Mitt Romney, or even governor, tend to be a lot more moderate to even more liberal than your typical national Republicans. Mike Lee's the exception to that rule, and that's probably one of the reasons why he did so poorly as compared to other Republicans. Again, 53% of the vote is very low for a Republican. I mean, even Donald Trump got 58% of the vote in Utah. And I think part of the reason is that some Republicans, obviously a decent amount of them, voted for Evan McMullin over the Republican nominee. Now, ultimately, this wasn't enough to win. Utah is a very Republican state. Republicans typically win anywhere from 20 to 30 points in the state. But Nebraska is, about just as red. And Democrats are basically employing this same strategy again. Now, it's not totally official, although if the filing date is over, they're basically probably going to endorse Osborne since he's the only person besides the Republican on the ballot. And he does have some opinions and positions that Democrats support. Now, back in 2014, there was another endeavor like this against Republican Senator Pat Roberts. Greg Orman only ended up losing this election by a little less than 11 points. And he would have been the first non-Republican to win a Senate seat in Kansas since the 1930s. Now, Kansas just happens to be south of Nebraska. It's part of the Great Plains, very historically conservative state, Republican state. And you have this same strategy being employed. Now, in this video, I'm really not going to talk about Angus King and Bernie Sanders, who are independents, but are essentially Democrats, because I think they're a bit more open about their Democratic and liberal views. But I think a lot of these independents in Republican states essentially will say anything to get themselves elected. Obviously, Democrats really don't have a choice anyway. It's either them or the Republican. Most of them are going to pick, obviously, the independent who has some liberal positions over the Republican. Now, the real question is, and I wonder if Dan Osborne has actually been asked this, which party he's going to end up caucusing in if he were somehow to win this Senate race, because that's probably something he would dodge for a very long time. He'd probably say he'd be unaffiliated, but of course he wouldn't get any committee assignments, etc. So it'd be a very interesting thing to see Dan Osborne actually answer a question like that, because obviously that could be a deal breaker for either side. If he agreed to caucus with Republicans, Democrats would be less inclined to vote for him. And of course, if he was to caucus with Democrats, he would surely lose this election by a decent amount. Now, Deb Fischer is pretty much your run-of-the-mill Republican candidate. Back in 2018, she won her re-election by almost 20 points. So essentially the same margin as Donald Trump. And even in 2012, when she was taking the seat of a Democrat who had decided not to run for re-election, she still won by around 15 points. So she's really had no problem winning in the state of Nebraska. Her electoral coalition is basically about the same of any Republican. She runs pretty heavy margins in rural and even ex-urban Nebraska. And of course, she tends to lose the bluer parts of the state, places in the urban areas around Omaha and Lincoln. So it's a pretty standard electoral coalition for a Republican. Now, an independent like Dan Osborne would probably do about the same as a Democrat, probably just a couple points better. Case in point, of course, Greg Orman in Kansas ran a very similar campaign as sort of this populist independent candidate. And he ended up basically getting the margins you would expect from a Democrat, except probably a little better. He won Shawnee County, which is home to Topeka. I think Joe Biden won that county in 2020 very narrowly. So he did overperform typical Democratic expectations. But he was by no means somebody who made this race exceptionally competitive. He did make the election a lot closer, but ultimately these independents failed to really win enough Republicans and moderates in order to win the state overall. Because I think the Republicans do a good job of framing these independents as essentially Democratic proxy candidates, which in a lot of ways they are. They're endorsed by the Democratic Party. A lot of their positions are aligned with the Democratic Party. In a lot of ways, they tend to lie about their positions or at least exaggerate their conservative credentials in order to get elected in a red state. And I think in today's very polarized climate, that strategy does not work, because I think the Republican Party has enough of its voters convinced that these independent candidates are not going to represent their interests in Washington. Now, interestingly enough, if we go to the 2024 Senate race, Dan Osborne is somehow polling against Deb Fischer. This is by Chains Research, a progressive polling firm. This isn't really that surprising. This is probably a push poll. I find it very hard to believe that, an independent who really doesn't have a lot of name recognition and who's only raised about $500,000 would be beating an incumbent Republican in a deep red state. But this is probably push polling to get Democrats and progressives interested in this candidate, to try and convince them that he can actually win statewide. Now, ultimately, I think this race still ends up in the safe Republican category. He could get probably in the low 40%, somewhere around there, or probably get a high percentage in Omaha and obviously Lincoln, again, traditionally Democratic areas. But I don't really see somebody like Dan Osborne having a coalition diverse enough to actually win, because rural parts, Nebraska, are still going to come in very strong for Deb Fischer. It's also a presidential year, so Donald Trump being on the ballot, I think, will certainly have an impact, especially if, Deb Fischer goes to one of these rallies of his or something like that. But she really doesn't need that kind of support. She essentially has the race in the bag already. You need to be an exceptionally talented independent candidate against a very scandal-plagued, corrupt, and unpopular Republican candidate, I think, to be able to win statewide in Nebraska. And I think as of right now, that sort of perfect storm for Democrats and progressives just isn't there. So while I think this strategy is interesting, in a lot of ways pragmatic, since a lot of these Democrats know they're not actually going to win as, you know, run-of-the-mill Democrats in deep red states like Nebraska and Utah, they can run sort of these Trojan horse candidates that are independents, who have some Democratic positions, ultimately probably will vote for Democrats in Washington, but speak enough on their conservative credentials to kind of fool conservatives and moderates in the middle. So ultimately, I don't really think much is going to come of this. I think it's a very interesting strategy. I think Democrats are hoping that eventually it actually works in their favor. So far, it hasn't. You know, again, most Republican voters are loyal to the GOP. They're going to vote for the Republican candidate. And especially with Donald Trump on the ballot endorsing, you know, Deb Fischer, for example, I don't really see somebody like Dan Osborne winning statewide, even if he does have a more impressive showing than Joe Biden does significantly in Lancaster County or Douglas County, for instance, areas where, you know, Douglas, he could probably get 58, 59% of the vote, but ultimately I think he's going to come short, and nothing's really going to come of this. Anyway, that's it for today's video. Please leave a thumbs up if you enjoyed, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell notification so you don't miss any more videos I put out. As always, again, thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.